the one and only Soul Nation on 104.6 FM with DJs Money Grip and Low Q. Check it out.
In May 1993, along with DJs from Frontline Soul Radio, Soul Control launched Soul Nation 104.6 FM. The Soul Nation launch party was attended by over 2,000 revellers and took place at the world-famous Hacienda in Manchester. The Greater Manchester-based unlicensed broadcaster was making waves across the northwest with its 24-hour underground mix of street soul, R&B and hip-hop. Despite being unlicensed, Soul Nation's aim was to emulate London's Choice and Kiss FM and gain an independent local radio licence from the Radio Authority. Soul Nation were never considered as a skull and bones pirate radio station. They and most of their avid listeners viewed them as merely an unlicensed station who ran as a legitimate business. Soul Nation had a full-time administration team who were managed by Yvette Evans and Godfrey Pemberton and staffed by Nicola Da Silva, Anna Kirkpatrick, Dawn Torrington, Valerie Blake and Kim Hannon. Several of the station's presenters were recruited from established independent local radio stations, and those that weren't were trained to ILR standards before they ever took to the air. Soul Nation FM stuck rigidly to the Radio Authority's broadcast code of conduct in preparedness for the day they'd hopefully be granted a full-time broadcast licence, so much so that they ran hourly independent radio news broadcasts, weather reports every 15 minutes and half-hourly traffic updates as standard. They kept to the Radio Authority's guidelines on advertising and kept their bulging advert slots to 3 3-minute advert slots per hour, with peak time advertising rates throughout the day and off-peak advertising from 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. daily. Soul Nation's original headquarters were housed in a flat on the Alexandra Park estate in Moss Side in south-central Manchester. The flat was initially cleared of its contents and decorated and furnished to a high spec in preparation for their grand station launch. The living room was converted into a high-tech broadcast studio consisting of a grey velour 3-piece suite, a navy blue carpet and rug, and a declaration on the studio notice board stating that the playing of reggae or ragga was a sackable offence. The station's standard equipment included 2 Technics turntables, a bespoke 6-channel broadcast mixer, broadcast quality Sennheiser microphones and headphones, double CD players and cassette decks, and all the equipment required to broadcast 24 hours non-stop. However, the station quickly outgrew these premises, so in March 1994 they moved to a large commercial complex in the South Manchester middle-class suburb of Chorlton-cum-Hardy, which had a very large broadcast studio space, 3 admin offices, bathrooms and shower facilities, a canteen, and space to integrate Soul Control's recording studio. Elaine Douglas, better known as Lainey D, was a famous BBC Greater Manchester and Sunset radio personality and presenter. She became the spiritual driving force behind Soul Nation and was instrumental in shaping the look, feel and ethos of the station, which proved critical in extending its audience reach. From small beginnings broadcasting 24/7 on 104.6 FM, Soul Nation was becoming the linchpin of a music empire that already encompassed a high-spec recording studio, a 20-kilowatt sound system rig, and a fledgling nationwide record production and distribution network. Soul Nation used a unique military-spec spread-spectrum microwave link from the studio to the transmitter site, which had several remote switchable frequencies. The microwave links the top pirates used were hard for the Radio Investigation Service to trace, but a unique link such as Soul Nation's meant that it was virtually untraceable, and it cost thousands of pounds in development costs to produce. They lost a couple of token transmitters over the 5-year period, but were never caught through technology. The one studio raid they did suffer on their 3rd birthday party came after a tip-off given to the authorities from a disgruntled ex-presenter, which was later confirmed to be true. The station used 800-watt commercial-grade crystal lock transmitters, sending out a crystal-clear signal through 20-foot fiberglass 5/8 wave aerials. This meant that they could be clearly heard in Liverpool, Wigan and Bolton to the west, Rochdale, Oldham, Blackburn, Burnley and Accrington to the north, Sheffield, Huddersfield and Bradford towards the east, and throughout Cheshire to the south. Between 1993 and 1998, official Radjar audience research figures put Soul Nation in the top 5 most listened to radio stations in the UK outside the national broadcasters. They were polled on average at 19% across the North West, with Key 103 being the largest on 22%, Piccadilly AM on 15%, Sunset on 8%, GMR on 3%, and Jazz FM on 2.5%. The Manchester Pirates got raided regularly, but the Radio Investigation Service generally left Soul Nation's transmitters alone because they desperately wanted the studio and staff after the North West's major commercial radio stations made repeated protests to the Radio Authority about Soul Nation's huge presence on the air and their loss of listeners to the unlicensed behemoth. The commercial radio stations finally threatened to stop paying their licence fees and to take legal action against the RA unless they acted to stop Soul Nation. Soul Nation's one and only studio raid in 1996 made the national TV, newspapers and radio news. The team behind Soul Nation applied for a restricted service licence in 1998 for 1 month, broadcasting out of the leafy South Manchester suburb of Whalley Range under the name Crystal FM. Towards the end of the Crystal FM RSL, there was a huge public backlash when Crystal FM's listeners were told the station was only on for 4 weeks. Manchester City Council, Greater Manchester Police, the Radio Authority and Tony Lloyd MP were inundated with complaints that the broadcasts would have to end. They all kept calling the studio and asking if the station were telling people to call them with complaints, to which the station said no. The Crystal FM staff told them they were free to listen live or to broadcast recordings which they had to keep as part of their licence if they required further proof. Only having 4 weeks on the air caused quite a big reaction, so big that the media descended on Crystal FM's base to see what all the fuss was about. The TV reports and newspaper articles made the public calls to keep Crystal FM on air even more fevered. The MP, Tony Lloyd, called after 2 weeks and asked to come and see Crystal FM, flanked by the ITV News and the Guardian Media Group, and broke the news that to stop his constituency office lines being clogged up with complaints, he'd contacted the Radio Authority himself and negotiated a further 2-week extension. To this day, Crystal FM are the only station to have been given an RSL extension and to run an RSL beyond 4 weeks. Within 6 weeks, they'd again obliterated the official Radjar figures, much to the dismay of the North West's ILR stations. The end of Crystal FM's transmissions was hard to see. Staff had broken down crying, furious listeners were calling and crying and urging them just to continue and come and defend the studio from any Radio Authority related raids. Emotionally, it was all too much to take, so the decision was taken that the RSL would be their final broadcast until they gained a full broadcast licence. Soul Nation applied for one of the new small-scale community radio licence in the early to mid-2000s with others, but they fell through the cracks. Their bid was unsuccessful, with the Radio Authority telling them, "You're not what we're looking for our small-scale community licence awards as you're too professional. We'd strongly advise you to apply for a commercial ILR licence." Soul Nation knew they'd stand zero chance against the big boys in terms of finances, or even against the smaller operators who were funded by the big network broadcasters to win ILR licences, which they would then legally buy from them a couple of years after launch. Crystal was apparently too big for the licences that All FM, Legacy and Unity were awarded, but not big enough to compete with Global and others. The commercial sector were happy with this because All FM, Legacy, Unity and the others were very unlikely to put a dent in the listening figures of the major radio networks. In one fell swoop, the Radio Authority and the major network broadcasters killed the vast majority of the 80s and 90s pirates, and their best presenters were dispersed to be diluted into the new local community radio station sector. This quenched the thirst of many presenters who just wanted to be heard on the radio without fear of prosecution, but it killed off the serious listener competition the ILR sector faced from unlicensed giants like Soul Nation FM. And if you really think about it, when was the last time anyone heard an ILR station complaining about competition from the community radio station sector? Exactly, Soul's job was done. The big network operators were the main winners, as the community radio sector barely registers above an average of 1.7% in the Rajah listening figures. From being dead set against the legal community radio sector, the major network broadcasters are now 100% in favour because they've ceded less than 2% of their viewers, as opposed to risking 20% with the big unlicensed operators like Soul Nation FM. Unfortunately, neither Soul Nation nor Crystal FM ever returned to the air after their 1998 restricted service licence period. The stations are still fondly remembered to this day as two of the most popular and professional unlicensed radio stations to ever hit the airwaves across the UK.
Hey, Rude Boy, you're now dealing with the one and only Soul Nation on 104.6 FM with DJs Money Grit and Low Q. Check it out.